Welcome back to Repairing and Rewiring Lights. Before we leap forward into the next part of this lecture, I'd like to talk about a couple of standards that are used by certified electricians and by people that do this type of work. The first is what's called UL certification, and UL is a governing body that does product safety testing and certification of appliances and things that are used along with electricity. There's also an organization called NEMA, which is the National Electrical Manufacturers set of standards for safe use and for manufacturing. So it's always important that you are aware of those safety standards and you adhere strictly to those safety standards anytime you're working with electricity. So let's jump back to where we left off last time, which was meeting that first challenge of sort of getting ready for doing the real work. So preparation often takes more, prepping things to do the job often takes more time than executing the job itself, because we sometimes find ourselves with unknowns like that challenge we had with busting the rust that was holding those parts together. So one of the first things we always want to do is figure out what materials we're working with. What is this lamp made out of? That's going to help me understand how to treat it. So I know when I'm working with soft metals like brass, bronze, and copper, non-ferrous materials, or with materials that have a plated finish, that have a chrome finish or a nickel finish on them, then I need to treat those more delicately than I might treat iron or steel. I want to try to figure out how it was put together, what tools are needed, and what replacement parts are going to be needed, and where can I source those replacement parts. So the first steps were to clean it up. You saw me clean it up a little bit by washing it up and using a nylon abrasive pad, stripping out the damaged wires and disconnecting or taking out the old socket. And then the next thing we want to do is to go ahead and do everything we can do to restore and refinish the lamp body and the shade, because once you get all this wire pulled through it, it's, you're not going to want to be soaking it in water or using solvents on it or having to work around that wiring and nastying that brand new wire up. So what I did while off camera was I went ahead and went back and tried again with a nylon pad. I just wasn't getting it as clean as I wanted to get it. So I came back in with a wire brush, and that wire brush the wire brush I chose was sensitive to the kind of material it was. So if I had taken a stainless steel wire brush, this copper, it would have made scratch marks all over the surface of it. So I took a soft brass brush and I took some degreasing cleaner. I used Simple Green, and I wire brushed the entire surface. Then I went over it with a nylon pad again, and this was doing two things for me. One is it was removing some of the spotty oxidation that was on the surface, but it was also getting that degreasing agent, that residual penetrant rust-breaking solvent that we put on there off of the surface so that it's absolutely clean. I then came back in and I wouldn't call it doing a patina, but I, in essence, re-oxidized the surface by spraying it down with hydrogen peroxide, allowing it to dry. And I went through that wet-dry cycle with a spray bottle of hydrogen peroxide a half a dozen times, and that helped soften anywhere that had gotten a little bright and shiny from the wire brush, and preserved the original patina, but came back in and cleaned it up and homogenized it a little bit, so there was not a lot of evidence of any of the workings that I was doing on it or any of that crusty, salty oxidation that was on the surface. And then I dried it completely. And I used a heat gun on a low setting to dry it up to about 110, 115 degrees, so it's warm to the touch, so that I drove all the moisture off of the surface. And then I came back in and put a coat of wax on it, some paste wax while it was still warm, let the solvent flash off that paste wax, and then buffed it to this kind of pearl finish that you see here. If I wanted more luster out of it, I could now come in and put a second coat of wax and then buff it again, but I'm very pleased with the way this looks, and I really don't want it to be shiny. I just want it to show off that patina a little bit. So the next thing that we're going to move on to is to, well, while we're off camera just a little time, I installed that coupling that I talked about on the inside that allows me to go from the original 1/8 inch nipple to up to the 1/4 inch nipple. So I've installed that coupling, and I went ahead and mounted my nipple up onto the replacement socket that I'm going to be using. Things rarely go this well, but I'm feeling really good about the fact that I was able to feed this cloth-covered wire through all the openings without having to open them up any further, because it would have been a real challenge to come in and deal with this little right angle that we have here. So I'm very pleased about that. But in the process of reassembling this, I came to the realization that once upon a time, this most likely had a link that was joining this, the pendant, the part that hangs down, to this eyelet so that it wasn't putting excessive strain on that cord, and that is missing. So I'm fortunate that I had some copper stock and some brass stock available that I could form this loop that I need to make to replace the part that's lost. So that's going to be something that is the next thing that I'm going to work on, is getting that squared away, and then we'll come back in. We'll make our wire connections, we'll secure the socket in place, and that might be it. Oh, we'll follow up and go through some of those different types of plugs that we could use on the end of this cord. So let's move to showing a little bit about how we are going to form this rod into this connector that we need to fabricate. Hey y'all, I wanted to make sure and include some of the things that I was using off camera to form that connector. So from top left, we've got proper eye protection. Anytime you're impacting material that could result in bits or pieces of debris coming off of that, it's unconditionally critical that we have proper eye protection on. Eye injuries are naggingly painful and take a really long time to heal, so let's always make sure we use proper eye protection like I've got there. You're also going to see a cross peen hammer, and I'm sorry, that's not a cross peen, it's a straight peen hammer. We know it's a straight peen because it has a bell face on one side and it has what's called a peen or a straight peen on the other side. And it's a straight peen because it's in parallel with the handle. A cross peen would be perpendicular to the handle. I have the copper rod that I was forming, and this is what I use to make the connector ring. I have a little benchtop anvil. I was working off of the bed of the anvil to flatten that stock from a round to an octagonal and to elongate it or draw it out. I was using the horn to form that ring end by wrapping it around there. Now, all the work that I did on this anvil is what we call cold work. And because I was working with copper, a non-ferrous material, it's soft enough that it wouldn't mar or damage this cast iron anvil. But I would never want to work steel or stainless steel on top of an anvil like this because it would just tear the hell out of it. We talked a little bit about annealing, and I wanted you to see what I was using to anneal. One could use propane, but MAP gas is a much better choice as far as I'm concerned because it can generate more BTUs. It gets a lot hotter, so it's going to get your piece warmed up faster to that proper dull red glow. Be mindful that this stuff should not be used without proper ventilation. It needs to be stored properly away from any sources of ignition, and you should always take your torch head off after you're done using it. Don't leave the tank stored with the torch head on it. Here I have a container that I was using for quenching that copper. So after I heated it, I had to quench it to keep it in that open position so that it was as ductile or malleable as possible for forming. And last but not least, proper hearing protection, because the ring that comes off that anvil is damaging to your hearing and increases stress levels in your body.